Hello, everyone. Welcome to this very important lecture this evening. Thank you very much for coming on what is truly a warm spring evening. So greatly appreciate that you are here. This is a very important lecture for a couple of reasons. One, because we have a very, very distinguished guest speaker here, but it is also the inaugural lecture of the Harlan Thompson Lectureship Fund. And this is the Harlan Thompson Lectureship established by Harlan Thompson, who was Dean of the Faculty of Architecture from 1980 to 1984. And Harlan is very discreetly sitting at the back of the room here. Harlan, it is because of you. And it is truly because of Harlan's generosity that we have this distinguished speaker tonight, and we will have more speakers as this speaker series unfolds in the coming years. The funds support the cost associated with bringing in speakers from a range of design and research disciplines, recognizing people whose significance extends beyond any one profession or field. So in that regard, it's also very, very timely. Guests will be invited from the full breadth of environmental design and related research activities, including industrial design, environmental psychology, sociology, anthropology, geography, and the physical sciences. So again, thank you, Harlan, for endowing the faculty with such a rich potential for the future. The title of the lecture tonight is Where is Our Civic Imagination? Which I think is a wonderfully appropriate title for many of the changes that I think are underway in cities around the world, including Winnipeg in many regards. Teddy Cruz is known internationally for his urban research on the Tijuana-San Diego border, advancing border and neighborhoods as sites of cultural production from which to rethink urban policy, affordable housing, and civic infrastructure. Of course, the San Diego-Tijuana border is a very contested border in many ways, and I think we'll see an unfolding of that topic tonight. It may not be that well known here, but certainly in the United States, the whole border issue, spanning from California to Texas, is one that is a very hotly discussed and very highly charged political topic. Teddy is the recipient of the Rome Prize in Architecture in 1991, and his honors include the James Sterling Memorial Lecture on the City Prize by the Canadian Centre of Architecture and the London School of Economics. In 2005, he won the Ford Foundation Visionaries Award, or the Visionaries Award in 2011, sorry, and in 2013, the Architecture Award from the U.S. Academy of Arts and Letters. His architectural and artistic work has been exhibited nationally and internationally, including representing the U.S. in the 2008 Venice Architecture Biennale and Small Scale Big Change at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 2010. Teddy is a professor in public culture and urbanism at the University of California, San Diego, where he is the founding co-director of the Center for Urban Ecologies and the Blum Cross-Border Initiative. He's recently served as special advisor on urban and public initiatives for the city of San Diego, leading the development of the Civic Innovation Lab. And so with that, I'll turn the evening over to Teddy Cruz. Thank you again.
Thanks, Ralph, for that introduction. Can you hear me well with this, the microphone? Yes? No, I was reflecting on this. Thank you for actually bringing me to Winnipeg, and thanks for the support of making this lecture possible, and hopefully many other lectures throughout the year. Is that correct? This part of this school year. I was reflecting on the relativity of springtime, you know, because I have tropical blood, you know, I come from Guatemala originally, and so I know that this is a springtime, or the beginning of, and I'm glad that you are here and not out there with the nice weather, but still it's freezing for me, so it's really, yes, I decided to pack as many stories as possible to share with the students and the faculty, obviously, and the audience, mainly because I know that, as Ralph mentioned, for many of you, the Tijuana-San Diego border, in the larger sort of scale, the border between Latin America and the United States might be a kind of foreign landscape, and I think it's important for me to share with you how this border prompted me to redefine my role as an architect, working within geographies of conflict. And I think that there is a subtext here which might apply to many of you in terms of your questions, your positions about what practice means today in architecture, what you are seeking to construct as a set of tools and concepts that mobilize your work. And so in a sense, even though there is a lot of specificity to the talk in the context of the border, I think at the end of the day, hopefully I'm really talking, broadly speaking, about the shifting of architecture practice today as we try to really redefine ourselves in the context of unprecedented crisis. Also, the border itself is not only located there, but as a friend of mine from Tijuana, Mexico, an artist who I work with often once said, that the Tijuana border is there just to be transgressed. And in that sense, that correlates metaphorically and operationally to the fact that we constantly are negotiating our own borders, obviously our own fears, our own conventions, and the redefinition again of our own positions. So I hope that it pertains to the discussion that is happening here in this school, but also obviously in Winnipeg as a city. I think that cannot begin sharing with you these thoughts without reflecting on the condition of the contemporary city at large. I think that by now it's obvious that the unprecedented explosion of urbanization, supported by the last decades of economic boom, also produced in tandem a dramatic project of marginalization. This is a first sort of reflection, obviously, I want to begin with. This, how would I call it, a kind of bad sister of neoliberal urban development. I'm talking about the unprecedented growth of slums surrounded many of these global capitals that we as architects have pursued as our sites or as our laboratories. So this unprecedented socio-economic inequality today across the globe, not only in the region that I occupy, but probably here in Winnipeg as well and beyond, is really at the center of today's urban asymmetry everywhere in the world. And it is really at the center of the discussion today about urban crisis. So inequality, I think, is one provocation we have to begin with in discussing and opening up these issues. I wanted also to suggest that urban crisis not only pertains to environmental crisis or economic crisis. I want to begin by forwarding it as a cultural crisis. The crisis, in other words, of institutions across pedagogy, research, development, governance, unable to reimagine themselves, unable to rethink their own protocols, unable to reimagine the ways, and I should say the stupid ways by which we have grown. And this not, I mean, I think I have the license to say this in such provocative ways because I come from the epicenter, really, of oil-hungry, selfish urbanization, which is Southern California, but after traveling from my hotel to here, I think these recipes of selfish and irresponsible sprawl are everywhere. And I think that this inability to reimagine, in fact, the unsustainable models of development that have exacerbated this growth in steroids is at the center of the problem. But in a way, I meditate sometimes that the problem is not only that way of growing, but the ideas, the kind of solutions we at times come up with as professionals in addressing the problem. So the problem in itself is really the pretension, sometimes in the way that we try to camouflage the problem itself. In other words, without challenging the very politics and economics of growth. What are the policies? What are the economics endorsing this irresponsible growth. In other words, my Homer, example is like, without challenging the size, without challenging the particular political economy of urban growth, it's very difficult to advance our rhetoric, our kind of conversation about sustainability today, because it's not only about wrapping buildings with morphogenetic skins or photovoltaic panels, but it's about really transforming or challenging, from our vantage point as professionals in architecture and planning and beyond, those very politics and economics that in fact have transformed cities from New York, obviously from Southern California to New York to Dubai, in urbanizations and cities of consumption particularly. Today I'm interested in sharing how I began to find different types of processes, different clues about the growth of the city, not through these global capitals, but through marginalized communities, which in my mind have remained environments or epicenters of productivity. And it's not about consumption only. So what is the future of urbanization is one first provocation that has always captivated me today, because and I get in trouble in my own field of architecture, because I sometimes have said that the future of the city today depends less on buildings. Suicidal, no, as an architect to say that, but that depends less on buildings and more on the fundamental reorganization of socio-economic relations. And that in some way, architects, designers, planners, we have a say in intervening, in fact, in reorganizing and reconfiguring those protocols and those relations. And also that the best ideas about the rethinking of urban growth, in fact, will not come from epicenters of wealth and of economic power, but it will come from environments of conflict, of marginalization, where citizens have taken upon themselves to reimagine governance and to reimagine the rules of the game. I think that this is fundamental. It's almost like the developers in many cities had their chance. Now, I think, is communities and the bottom-up practices that begin to give us very different processes to reimagine the city. So yes, inequality across these registers is fundamental topic to begin the conversation as the resources have been mobilized from the many to the very few in the last years of economic crisis and continue in the kind of post-crisis period to consolidate. In this case, I'm interested to visualize crisis. I think as an artist, I've always been interested in the visualization of conflict, the exposure of conflict. And I found this interesting text by Emmanuel Saez and Thomas Piketty, which I imagine you already have heard of, which focuses primarily on the story of American inequality. But I love the study because they came up with these two lines as devices to really understand and visualize the crisis. Two lines that stretch and compress across time. You see one peak on one end, the other peak on the other end. And obviously, maybe you already are getting the message here, but at those two moments, 1926 and 2006, is where we find the largest income inequality in the United States. You see those peaks referring to that. But the amazing provocation that they actually produce out of this research is not only measuring that visually, but then correlated to the line beneath, which in fact mirrors that topography, the two peaks on each end in the middle zone. And it is because at those two moments, when we found the largest socioeconomic inequality in the United States, we can also find the lowest marginal taxation on the wealthy. So this really, I don't know if this pertains to you here in Canada, because obviously in our eyes, or in some of our eyes, you have always sort of, how would I say, benefited from a kind of more social democratic agenda, more public kind of aspiration. But nevertheless, for us in the United States, was a kind of shock to see this, because the American public continues to be hijacked by this idea of the American dream as promised by what has been called a kind of trickle-down economic model, that if we detax the wealthy, somehow all of us will become rich one day. And this study finally rendered clear the hypocrisy of such position. That in the moments of largest income inequality, we also have the moments of huge institutional unaccountability across government, across private, sectors, and so on. But while this is clear, I hope, to all of us, nobody has been talking about the middle zone, which is really the valley in this topography. And this refers to a period that I think today we need, at least in the United States, to recuperate the kind of institutional memory of that period, because after the Great Depression, as many of you know, FDR already forwarded a very compelling and provocative document called the Bill of Rights that paved the way to a new deal in the United States, a new deal that really opened decades of investment in unprecedented ways across sectors. Civic philanthropy, government, universities, and communities synergizing to invest in unprecedented ways in public infrastructure, in public housing, in public parks, public health. In fact, public was not a forbidden word in our political language as it has become in recent decades. So this is exactly, and I would love to really open up this topic. While I'm romanticizing that period, which obviously, statistically speaking, in the work of Thomas Piketty, it showed that, well, here we find the 99 to 1% ratio of resource distribution. Here we have a more 60-40 maybe redistribution of resources, but also we all know that during that period we found very faulty ideas of design in a way informing that public mandate. I'm talking about the construction of freeway ecology and the badly informed public housing projects that just ended up demonizing modern architecture from the public imagination. But anyway, there is a lot to say that is not only good things that happened here, but nevertheless, that period was characterized by a public imagination. That in certain moments of this pendulum, we have a private interest guiding the conversation, and some others, it is a public commitment that really enables the reorganization of those resources. And obviously, at the end of the day, my question is, where is our valley today in the United States? It's difficult to imagine appearing anytime soon. So where is the public today is a question. And in my mind as an architect, I began to provoke or try to be self-critical in saying I must move from the abstraction of my definition of the public. I went to architecture school where I thought that to engage public space was just simply decorate it, to beautify space, thinking that if I make a space beautiful, everybody will show up. And I wanted to move away from that abstraction to the specificity of rights to the city. So how to move from the abstraction of the public to the specificity of urban rights brought me more and more to the specificity of the political embedded in the cross-border flows that really permeate my own geography of conflict with amazing possibilities. Let's put it this way. I found the public distributed in the informal bottom-up emergencies, let's say, the kinds of bottom-up urbanization across the US-Mexico border. So this idea that I wanted to re-encounter my own locality, which obviously in the university I teach is sort of forbidden because we tend to denigrate the local, okay? We always want to connect as a university to a global conversation, but we always ignore what is behind, next to us. And I think that for me it was essential to re-encounter the region. This is a sort of figure ground drawing of the Tijuana-San Diego border, just to introduce you to a few of the players that I'm interested in narrativizing tonight. To the north, you find San Diego. To the south, Tijuana. I reverse the equation, and white is buildings, and black is empty space, just to show how the density of Tijuana crashes against San Diego. And then you see the blue, which is how the Colorado River descends south, enters into Tijuana, becomes the Alamar River, goes through the city, is channelized with concrete, and moves northbound to exit back into San Diego, into what is the Tijuana River estuary, an environmental zone. So I decided to cut a cross-section across this territory. Obviously, my work pertains to the border itself, but more and more I began to realize I needed to really engage the transversal border, how the border is reproduced infinitely. Probably the border here arrives to Winnipeg in terms of the fragmentation of institutions, of communities and jurisdictions. So I began to this narrative called the 60 linear miles of transborder conflict, cutting a cross-section between San Diego and Tijuana sequentially, 30 miles deep into San Diego, 30 miles deep into Tijuana, and with my camera, I began to photograph panoramas of the landscape where I actually, in my mind, saw a dramatic collision of ecologies, sites of conflict between top-down conditions of urbanization, forces of urbanization, and bottom-up social or environmental systems. So I began very close to my university in northern San Diego, near La Jolla, where we found some of the wealthiest real estate pretty much in the world, where I found the conflict between top-down development and the topography as developers flatten the topography of San Diego to install their cheap recipes of suburbanization in the shape of master plan gated communities. This conflict between top-down development and the topography. Follow that sequentially, the conflict between large infrastructure and the watershed systems. I'm referring to the gargantuan freeway ecology that descends from the coastal cities in Southern California and collides with the natural hydrology of the land. Conflict between gated communities and everyday life, or as the writer Rebecca Solnit once called it, the conflict between planning and social life, or the apartheid of social life. The conflict between military bases and environmental zones, the only places from Los Angeles to Tijuana where what is otherwise a continuous urbanization throughout the coast, the only places where that continuous sprawl is interrupted is where we find the military bases. So this is a strange, again, alliance between systems of militarization and urbanization. The conflict between formal and informal economies and densities, as many immigrant neighborhoods have been transforming into more complex socioeconomic systems by countering the recipes of top-down formal urbanization. The conflict between two border cities now reaching the border, the conflict between two border cities that do not give a damn about each other in constructing their future. As we enter into Tijuana, we see that river, the concrete river, remember that I told you, the channelized river, as it pierces the border wall tangentially. So the conflict between the river and the border, the conflict between the informal and natural ecologies in Tijuana, as some of the shanty towns in Tijuana are also overlaid on top of the watershed systems, undermining their functionality. The conflict between factories and emergency housing in the edges of Tijuana. Tijuana has become one of those tax-exempted zones to enable multinational companies to come and take advantage of cheap labor without any accountability, a city of factories, and the slums that they produce. The conflict between density and sprawl, as Tijuana Mexican developers are imitating the recipes of San Diego to produce new social housing, imitating the master plan gated communities, but in miniature. The conflict finally at the other end of these 60 linear miles, probably one of the places that I wish I could take each of you in a trip, in this sort of tour of the border, is that place where the border wall, after traveling miles and miles of the Tijuana territory, finally sinks into the Pacific Ocean. And I think that this is probably the mama of all conflicts today, the conflict between the natural and the political. I think this is a very dramatic site that becomes a panorama of the image that I constructed for the Architecture Biennale in Venice in 2008. And I juxtaposed it with that horizon of local conflicts that I was briefly introducing you to, arguing, in fact, that in today's, yes, in the context of those sites of collision, we need to, as architects and planners and throughout our design professions, we need to reposition ourselves in the midst of each of those conflicts. It's almost as a kind of, how would I call it, forensics of urbanization that enables us to meditate and reflect on the mechanisms, institutional mechanisms, that produce such a stupidity. In other words, that produce each of those conflicts. Again, that we cannot really confront the crisis today as designers without gaining the knowledge of the conditions themselves that produce the crisis. It is the conditions themselves that become the material for the contemporary architect, is what I was arguing in this installation that became literally the entrance into the exhibition that curated a variety of practices across the US that were engaged in the same challenge. But again, the border is physical, and it is in fact an artifact, a political artifact that transforms San Diego into the world's largest gated community, many times I've said. In fact, the urbanization of fear that has perpetuated traditional ideas of planning that are only interested in the separation of communities, of jurisdictions, and of the territory itself into an archipelago of enclaves that do not have any relationship to each other. So this not only is a provocation, but at the same time is to suggest that at the bookends of these 60 linear miles is where we find some of the wealthiest real estate in the world, as the one found in the edges of San Diego in a place called Rancho Santa Fe, where the Pritzkers live, barely 25 minutes away from some of the poorest settlements in Latin America. This radical proximity between wealth and poverty, obviously reproduced everywhere in the world, but here somehow dramatized as these two environments collide with each other. Not only a reflection on these conditions has been important to my practice located within this geography of conflict, but I'm also primarily interested in the counter procedures to those imposed political and economic recipes. And that's what has guided me to try to understand the power of informal urbanization at this place, at this site of juncture, of collision. Obviously, because informal urbanization is simply that. It's a set of procedures, strategies that counter those imposed forms of urban growth. And in so doing, really reflect and document and research the social, as I call them, the social practices of adaptation as the marginalized communities on both sides of the border, proven to be incredible laboratories in their own marginalization from the institutions of power. In terms of their own survival, they have to reinvent modes of governance, modes of collaboration and intervention into the territory in order to really enable other ways of constructing the city, and why not to say at this very contested site, other ways of constructing citizenship. I will get to that later fundamentally, but I've really been interested, being next to Arizona, you can imagine, where I decided not to put a foot on, then when Sheriff Arpaio was just going crazy. I don't know if those news got here, but basically citizenship has become such a divisive topic in the United States, separating us from them. And in reality, we have ceased to treat that notion in an emancipatory way. Citizenship for me and my research has become primarily a creative act in the hands of communities to invent their own or to really set in motion their own ways of living. In other words, a creative act that reorganizes institutional protocols, and why not to say it, the spaces themselves of the city. So I began to visualize many processes of adaptation of the environment itself in the hands of immigrants, but also in the hands of teenagers in Southern California. And this story, and as an artist, I teach in the visual arts department, and so I've been lucky to also have the opportunity to intervene into public debates about public space in the city. So the visualization, the narrativization of these stories has been important through images and videos and documents. This one is called Constructing Citizenship, a Chronology of an Invasion. Tells the story of a group of teenagers that transformed this leftover space near my house in San Diego. The story begins with very simple maps. This one is a typical sort of exercise of erasing the buildings of the city and just leaving the archipelago of empty space around them, reflecting on the fact that this archipelago of leftover, this compendium of voids, has been produced by stupid planning, again, in the way that it has polarized these environments by a legislature of a division, setbacks, easements, brownfields, paper streets, etc., etc. I would love to tell you about paper streets in Southern California, but there is no time for that. Let's just focus on one of the islands. Again, a lot of my research is hugely impressionistic. I call it a kind of accurate approximation, okay, to the issues. Because when I zoomed into this island, which is the typical place of collision between freeway and neighborhood, I began to find a story that was very specific. It was a group of teenagers that I began to interview because I witnessed, as I was going from my house to the university, this phenomenon. They decided one night to get together to begin organizing because they found that the city wasn't really offering them any options in terms of a skateboard park, basically. And together they decided to go to Home Depot, buy shovels, and they decided as a group, as a micro-community, to invade this place under the freeway. Now, when I went to the municipality to request a parcel map of this site where the teenagers had invaded, this is what they gave me. So this is a more accurate now island from my archipelago. 2 weeks later, after they began to dig their own mounds for the skateboard park, the police stopped them. They barricaded the place, and they were evicted. The teenagers, when I interviewed them through months of conversations, they told me something that none of my colleagues has ever told me. They said that the first thing they needed to do in order to fight back, in a way, the city officials that had done this, was to gain the knowledge, research, in fact, who owns that place and who owns the resources behind it. So they researched and they found out that they had been hugely lucky because they had not begun digging under Caltrans territory, they told me. You know, Caltrans is the state agency that governs the freeway. And as you know, in Southern California, the freeway is sacred. Nobody touches it. They had been lucky because they had begun digging under an arm of the freeway that belongs to the local municipality, enabled them to have a point of access in terms of the conversation. They were also lucky, they said, because they had begun digging in a Bermuda Triangle of jurisdiction between Port Authority, Airport Authority, 2 city districts, and a design review board. In essence, all these red lines were the invisible institutional lines of jurisdictional power inscribed in that seemingly neutral no man's land. And they began to then organize themselves further, and as skaters, as a micro-community, they decided to confront city officials with that knowledge. They talked to the city attorney and the city council that ended up getting involved out of the two. And they were advised that in order to continue the conversation and the process, they had to turn into an NGO. They didn't know what an NGO was, so they had to then confer with other teenagers in Seattle who had in fact built a similar skateboard park. This transference of knowledge across activist practices has been part of my research also. They realized they had to get their act together. They got a lawyer, they began to fundraise, they began to investigate the specificity of each a permit in the books, in the city code pertaining to temporary encroachment, transitional use and so on. They began to realize, in one of the most dramatic moments in the interview, they tell me they began to realize how stupid it was, the definition of open space in the planning code. That it was just green, undifferentiated space surrounding buildings. And that they were interested, in fact, in expanding the categories of land use when it came to public space. The process is long. I have a lot of other stories to tell you, but it suffices to say that throughout this process, they ended up winning the case, and out of a transference of liability, the city transferred from the public, because that piece of land that was empty and unused is public, they transferred it to a semi-private ownership because they committed as a group to manage the space itself. So as an NGO, they were able to then have ownership of the space for 1 cent a year, and they were able to build their own skateboard park under that freeway. Now, for many people, again, and many times I say, this might seem like a trivial story. For me, it was a fundamental moment in understanding many concepts that have been pivotal to my own practice of intervention. One, that conflict here was a creative tool. This is something that is clear, that they were not just satisfied with putting Zapatista mats and going to the plaza with pancards to request change. They took it upon themselves to invent and construct a process. And that's what I would consider an activist practice. A set of procedures that enable the reconfiguration of top-down policy. So in this case, conflict opened up a process. Second, and I was victim and continue at times to be victim of this, I say community-based. What do we mean by community? Community is too facile of a term for many of us engaged in these issues. They came together not only because they had affinities, they came together out of a condition of urgency, but also, obviously, because they really enable themselves as practitioners. So I really love this notion of communities of practice, because here it became a praxis that was being built together with the process, and also the fact that this is proof that an informal act of transgression into jurisdictional power, this informal gesture began to trickle upwards to transform top-down policy. So this is fundamental to me because many people in my field criticize me that I only focus on the informal and on the small. I'm interested in that arduous process that takes us from the bottom up into, again, the top-down to reorganize existing agendas. And finally, this is also in the context of being an architect who is still interested in buildings, is that we actually can not only talk about physical things, cannot talk about just designing objects, but also the interface between those objects could be designed. So the relationship of public space as a physical thing designed in tandem with the protocols that would assure that that space would be sustainable socially and economically. I think this is a fundamental message that this group of teenagers gave me. And out of these questions that should be part of any of you students and us professionals when we try to intervene in the city are fundamental to begin any process. Whose territory is this and who owns the resources? Because it is that material that would enable us to produce more critical interfaces between space and protocols. And this is what has then brought me to try to research the spatial and social practices that move across the border, this trans-border informal urbanization, as I have called it, in two main flows, from south to north, the flow of people, obviously going from Latin America into the US, the impact of immigrants, and from north to south, the flow of waste from Southern California to build the slums of Tijuana. These are very dramatic images when I began to research them years ago, when I realized that the levee towns of Southern California were being dismantled by developers who wanted to build a more inflated version of that recipe in the shape of McMansions. So those small bungalows from the post-war years were now being purchased by Mexican speculators and brought into Tijuana. So these are houses waiting to cross the border. Not only people cross the border, but entire pieces of infrastructure move from one city to the other. And when these houses enter into Tijuana, they are put on top of these steel frames, leaving the first floor to become a kind of second-hand urbanization. And this sort of layering of opposites begins to produce a really intensive urban condition. Let me suggest, I am not saying that that's what we should imitate. What I'm trying to actually say is that there is something super interesting about that process that I began to investigate. I'm saying that because I always get a lot of trouble, just to, primarily with people in San Diego, but not only houses, but entire, how would I call it, the kind of urban debris of Southern California moving into Tijuana. You have seen how the rubber tires are used for retaining walls in these shanty towns, but look at what people have been able to do in conditions of socioeconomic emergency. They have figured out a system where they peel off the tire, they clip it and interlock them to produce a more efficient retaining wall. So you cannot avoid, while I might be romanticizing these environments, to really see them as incredible laboratories for the kind of creative intelligence found in these communities of practice. The garage doors from Southern California that are imported into Tijuana to construct social housing. So let's imagine the shanty towns of Tijuana being built with those garage doors. as a new scheme for their construction and so on. So yes, this bricolage of informal urbanization that recycles the waste of the other to produce new opportunities has been compelling, but I've also asked myself to be careful, because it's not just the image of that I'm interested, mainly when in artistic fields, and mainly in architecture, the informal has come back to our conversation. I want to be careful that we don't only glorify the informal as just an aesthetic category, but that we understand it as a praxis. This has been fundamental to my research, the informal as praxis, and by that I mean the investigation of the everyday practices across social, economic, and political and social organizations, processes that are enacted to the construction of these environments. In other words, instead of just rushing to this amazing dramatic image to analyze them formally, I was interested in taking a detour to try to understand what I ended up calling the political economy of waste, because in fact, the recycling of all that waste is part of an economy of sustainability and accessibility for otherwise the absence of housing, either through government or private development in those environments. Furthermore, the idea that to enter these issues, I had just not to look at the house itself, but at the conflict between factories, labor, and housing. In other words, there's a lot to say about this, but in many projects that we develop in my research center, we try to identify conflicts that are the points of access to a process. Who are the stakeholders? Who are the institutions at play? What are the sites, the representations, the policies, and so on? Because I realized that the shantytowns of Tijuana are surrounding these factories, because the factories place themselves, the Japanese, Chinese, the Korean and European factories place themselves next to these shantytowns to take advantage of cheap labor without giving anything in return. So I decided that instead of taking the position of Habitat for Humanity, of Architecture for Humanity that rushes to the problem by building housing for the poor, which we must do anyway, but just building boxes for people might also perpetuate the problem, I decided to experiment and say, let's take a detour. I love this notion of the detour, that in order to get to an issue, we might have to actually take a detour to contact the domains that have been peripheral to the discussion in our field, namely, obviously, the socio-economic and political registers. So I went to the factory itself, because I realized that these factories could be a site of intervention that have amazing materials, an array of production systems and so on. In fact, this one is this is a collection of photos that I took of this Korean maquiladora, where I went to engage them to see if we could use their pallet rack systems, their lightweight metal processes, and I proposed to the CEO of the factory, can we as architects use your materials, recombining them lightly to produce micro-infrastructures that can then be supported by municipal subsidies and distributed by community activists. So that's where we experimented with the construction of this prototype, which is basically a space frame that does not need welding, using the materials themselves of the factory, or using straightforward the pallet rack system that they use to export all over the world, to use them as sort of a hinge mechanism to produce a variety of combinations, such as this one, which is the water beam, which is basically simply a structural spine that then receives a lighter systems, but at the same time is a water collection trough. Or again, as I mentioned, the pallet rack that stitches the waste, such as the houses, the garage doors, the pallet racks, and so on. So this was the provocation we made to the municipality of Tijuana to suggest that we could produce a project of collaboration across institutions. I'm rushing through this material. There is a lot more to say about it, but I wanted just to suggest briefly what has been a process of intervening here. Obviously, it became a scaffold system that visualized or proposes to visualize the evolution of these environments through time. Basically, this is an example of what I ended up calling transitional infrastructure. That is not really about imposing a particular condition, but just enabling the evolutionary patterns of construction and growth of these environments. There is, again, a lot to say, and I know that I don't have time, but you know, once somebody in the middle of the talk, if you were more irreverent, you would have raised a hand and would have asked me, who the hell are you to say that those people like to live surrounded by trash? If you were to ask them, everybody would love to live in a Mac mansion in San Diego. This is what somebody told me once. And I said, you know what? You are right. I have asked that question. Obviously, that's the case. But when will that happen? Next year? In the next 5? In the next 50 years? And this became a way of answering to myself one fundamental issue. What do we do in the meantime? And I realized that there is a role for infrastructural systems to really become agile and flexible enough to enable transition in these environments. And why not to say it, aesthetically speaking also, enable a more political aspect of aesthetics where socioeconomic spatial transparency, it's kind of a mouthful, how do you say, a fool, that these transactions could be ultimately visualized. Because if there is one concept that for me has been essential in understanding the informal, is that it is here where we find an incredible creativity in negotiating time, boundaries, space, and resources simultaneously. Time becomes material, and this is something that has been absent from planning, I think, logics. I don't know how many of you have seen this video, but I think that, how many of you have seen this video? Oh my God, almost half for those of you who haven't seen it, for me it's a way of maybe telling the story more accurately. Obviously, it's a shanty town in Bangkok. I'm not again suggesting that we should build train tracks so close to neighborhoods. But look at what happened after the train passes by. In a matter of seconds, the market comes back to life and the market is reconstructed. So in essence, if there is something that maybe is clear here, how do we enable a space to transform? I mean, this has been part of our aspiration at times in the most incredible moments of architectural utopianism, right? I mean, can we imagine spaces that are agile, flexible, inclusive, enough that enable transformations to accommodate different accessibility and different modes of inclusion and sustainability, etc.? Can infrastructure enable that negotiation between large and small, between formal and informal, between the planned and the unplanned? And further, suggesting that it's not only about the creative intelligence of the bottom up. My friend Mike Davis, who lives in San Diego, once almost slapped me on the face and said, let's be careful, because we don't want to send a message out there that these communities are so creative that they will resolve their own problems on their own. They need support. And so here at play is also the question of how top-down resources can in fact be supportive of that bottom-up intelligence, enabling us to reimagine the very notions of infrastructure, inhabitation, and so on. So while waste moves southbound, people go north in search of dollars. And that's really the other side of the coin in my research at the San Diego-Tijuana border, is the impact of immigrants in the transformation of the American neighborhood. And this story called The Non-Conforming Buddha begins actually with another map, which is what I call a cross-border land use map, which does not exist. Imagine that at the most trafficked border in the world, the largest binational metropolitan region in the world, there is not one single land use map between these two cities that is understood or that through which they could share a mutual awareness of their own policies. So I had to splice it in a kind of cut and paste situation in a very lyrical way, showing to the north in San Diego the large exclusionary zoning of bedroom communities, of small slivers of retail in the shape of malls and strip malls, and so on, this sort of large archipelago of land use. And to the south, what I already showed you, evidence of the high pixelation of what I ended up calling a kind of confetti of alternative uses. So I began to argue that this confetti of alternative uses has begun to infiltrate itself in the last decades into the largeness of Southern California, that the future of Southern California depends on the alteration of the large with the small. And that small obviously is not only spatial, but programmatically producing more intensive socioeconomic contingencies into space to make this environment sustainable. But when that confetti hits the ground, it begins in many of these marginalized immigrant communities, begins to transform small parcels through equal to Tijuana in terms of informal economies and densities, through informal, again, uses and economies. Let's say an immigrant family plugging into a garage an informal economy, or building illegally a granny flat to support an extended family. These constant negotiations with, again, boundaries, resources, and space begin to produce what I've called an urbanization of retrofit, from which we, in fact, could learn if we were actually able to translate those dynamics into abstract, at times, frameworks that can enable a very different agenda of land use. I'm maybe jumping the gun here, but an essential part of my research practice has been to act as a facilitator of that hidden knowledge, the translation and representation of that knowledge, and also one knowledge that is narrativized. The informal Buddha, in fact, is the story of a small house, a kind of post-war, again, bungalow that did not go in exile into Tijuana, remain in San Diego only to be retrofitted by a group of monks, transforming this small house and the small parcel into a Buddhist temple. And they organized the parcel in very dense ways, illegally, of course, and this opened up a topic that also became fundamental in my trajectory. That is not only obviously the physical, I hope that that's already maybe clear, but embedded in these neighborhoods are agencies such as the Buddhist temple, church groups, non-profit organizations that are rooted in those environments, and they become the informal city halls of sorts that enable the translation and representation of those informal transactions and bundle them into new agendas, new programs, social, economic, and cultural. So these are mediating agencies that, while protecting those who need to be protected and not exposed, they actually translate and represent that knowledge towards governance. They interface, they negotiate the interface between institutions and communities. So from these processes has been essential, again, to reimagine a new political language. This is fundamental today, I think. For example, if I was to ask many of the students here, how do we rethink density? What is density? Probably many of you would answer what is obvious, which is density is an amount of objects per area. Well, through my research in collaboration with these non-profit organizations, it's been clear that this has been fundamentally the most stupid recipe that we can use as architects or planners. That the city cannot be treated as a collection of disparate objects that are just thrown indiscriminately through the territory without any relationship to each other. That in fact, in many of these neighborhoods, density could be measured differently as an amount of social exchanges per area. What images would that yield? What types of protocols would that enable, etc.? I think was a fundamental provocation that I came up with many of my collaborators, the activists in these neighborhoods I've been working with. Again, the idea that marginal neighborhoods are sites of production. This is what I mentioned earlier. While as architects we've been focusing on the global city as a site of consumption, where architecture has served the role of just decorating, in fact, at times, the exclusionary politics and economics of development, many of these immigrant communities across the world have remained sites of cultural production. I'm interested in the provocation of the kind of contested space in between consumption and production. How do we return the notion of productivity to the city? So from the alternative confetti to entering into specific collaborations with non-profits, designing processes, designing micro-policies and new economic pro forma for housing, and the types of spatialization that can emerge from that has been really the summary of my efforts in many of these environments. The idea, again, of returning to a more localized form of governance, the neighborhood as a political unit within which we can reconsider the notion of the social economy of housing. Again, we treat housing just as an amount of units, not really understanding the relationship within the social and economic framework. Through this, and I hope I'm not confused, I told you I brought way too many concepts, but I hope you're following. But through this effort, two major provocations. Rethinking zoning. We already talked about rethinking density. Rethinking zoning, for God's sake. I mean, really, zoning has been institutionalized as a punitive tool to prevent socialization. Initially, I imagine zoning was not considered as such. It was probably more of a generative tool to organize activity. I was talking today about this with Orly, I think, about how we talk about zoning in more creative ways. How do we design zoning that can be generative tool to organize economy? And through that, the rethinking of ownership. So this is the other side of the coin again in San Diego, while in Tijuana, the site of intervention or the detour has been into the factory. In San Diego, the detour took me to the developer's spreadsheet, which in fact has a huge amount of knowledge that we need to steal. In fact, the capacity of a developer to manipulate and control resources and time to maximize profit, there is a huge intelligence in that spreadsheet, and I began to suggest, why can't we appropriate that pro forma and inject it with the hidden value of informal economy, of sweat equity, of collaboration, of the type of new political representation that these NGOs really develop. Let's say two women who rent a 3-bedroom apartment, transforming it illegally into a nursery to take care of the children of their own families and of the neighborhood, and the non-profit that in fact represents them and channels funding to support that neighborhood practice. How do we enable that to become part of a pro forma? And I've been collecting, and this is one project that I hope to come back to really show its specialization and realization. But let's say 3 immigrants. I work a lot with this woman who makes Guatemalan tamales in San Diego out of her own little kitchen in a similar Levittown little house in one of those neighborhoods. She sustains her economy as a undocumented immigrant through that sale, that micro business, similar to the other 2 people. As an architect, I can come, tell them, they don't speak English, first of all. Tell them, I want to represent you. I know the types of funding that you can have access to if you become a cooperative or a nonprofit. And they become my clients, let's say, if I was to be a developer here. They become not only my clients, but also the co-owners of a possible project. 2 script writers who have they rent a small black box theater in San Diego. That their dream is to build a small box theater for themselves and invest a little bit to produce a housing unit for them next to it. And a couple of professors at my university who want to invest their housing allowance because they don't want to live in an apartment, but they just want to have an open space and so on. This is a larger kind of story. What I'm trying to say is that there is nothing that should prevent us from being the developers of our own housing as artists, as architects. This is a longer conversation because San Diego, in a way, where I come from, has become an epicenter of architects becoming developers of their own work. And the provocation that I began to send here was, how can these everyday practices, how can an economic pro forma of a developer be an instrument to construct community? Eventually, when the project might be built, it will have an industrial kitchen that will be used by these entrepreneurs, let's say, to scale up their own business, and the relationship between the Black Box Theater, the kitchen, the food, and the housing could become a really interesting prototype of housing and mixed use. So this, accompanied by new forms of governance, is an important final piece. Can we design new political and economic processes? That's pretty much, again, the agenda here. I think that architects and planners, we can really be contributing with new processes that re-engage or reimagine the political. Very quickly, because, I wanted to finish with the last couple of projects, but I cannot help showing you briefly the kind of process here. Casa Familiar, just as an example of the designing of a micro policy, Casa Familiar is the main nonprofit I've been working with in San Isidro, which is the first neighborhood after the checkpoint into the US to design a micro policy. The activist of Casa Familiar, Andrea Scorepa, told me when I came for the first time years ago, she said, before we begin designing this housing project, we first have to design the political and economic framework within which that housing project will be sustainable. It was a slap on the face as an architect. You know, can we design a protocol? We presented this to the planning department in San Diego, again, proposing that the nonprofit embedded in that neighborhood would become a mediating agency that would map many of these illegal alterations of space throughout these parcels, map them so they become real and tangible, but basically represented by the nonprofit. Through that, the designing of a new community engagement project beyond the advocacy planning rhetoric of architects coming to communities, asking communities, what do you want? The communities telling them that they just want Aztec pyramids or a mural on the outside wall of a Costco. How to problematize the relationship between community and professionals. So beyond the politics of identity, so that the everyday practices of these neighborhoods could be part of the reorganization, again, of those parcels. So we had to invent a variety of tools to really rethink density. This is where a lot of the density social exchanges emerged. I would love to tell you many of these stories about it, because this lady told me one of the most amazing conceptions of density in that workshop years ago. She said that density is neighborhood collaboration, and she also gave me one of the most fundamental definitions of density, that density is not about objects, but about spaces, she said. So all I'm trying to say is that we cannot think of these zoning or political or economic shifts without a new or a renewed set of methods, of protocols for community engagement, to really raise the conversation to another level of criticality and so on. And obviously from here, the idea that these parcels that were documented, we engaged the municipality to enable those illegal additions to be officialized as an affordable housing overlay zone in the neighborhood through a new model of ownership in partnership, the nonprofit and the residents forming a social agreement to co-develop those extra units that they had to now refurbish and rent them if possible. So what I'm trying to say is that residents then become co-developers with the nonprofit in a very local kind of format. And this would reinstate, which is a major provocation to be made today in the United States. We need to return to a small-scale development. The typical development that used to be supported by lending and zoning during the New Deal. So people in neighborhoods could build a duplex, a triplex, a fourplex, or a sixplex and sustain their own economies. Now that is not possible today because of subsidies only paying huge density ratios. So the 50-unit density equation that gives subsidies to large affordable housing developers, making it unaccessible to communities to really capitalize on this, we propose to shatter that into 50 small pieces, as long as the nonprofit would represent that loan or that subsidy structure. If those units were rebuilt at the same time, there is no reason why those could be considered under a tax credit-based financing policy. So a more distributed idea of financing at a very local scale, the prepackaging of permits and the social agreements that would assure that when a neighborhood dweller or resident would transform their house and just sell it and go to the next neighborhood, that would not happen here. So this was a way of challenging gentrification by connecting the process to a more legible set of guarantees across the agencies. I had to take you through that little mandala of cross-sector relations because I think that's fundamental to the rethinking today of process. We need to be facilitators of new types of interfaces across community, financing, governance, and so on. So all this is to say that the rethinking of the community's role today in co-producing housing. Can neighborhoods be developers of their of their own housing and public space? And can small parcels be understood as small socio-economic systems. So the specialization of this particular project, because this nonprofit, when we began to work together, they began to buy land. It's almost like a national bank, land bank, but at the scale of the neighborhood, in a sense. And the project that we've been trying to build in the context of this proposal is to transform an existing church from 1920s into a neighborhood incubator where these new types of community engagement would be paving the way for the development, and new programs would be conceptualized between architects, nonprofit, and residents. They purchased the other small parcel next door. We proposed an incremental development where these small rooms charged with electricity and collective kitchens to support that type of entrepreneurship I talked about before. And these very simple spaces could be the basis for injecting into them very specific social, cultural, and economic programs, but become, in fact, the seed for housing. And it is here where the first model begins to appear, which is a housing prototype catering to single mothers with children, then a duplex that would be given as an exchange of rent for social service with two social practice artists that want to work with communities in co-managing the programs that are injected into those spaces. This idea of shared management between residents and artists is important to the equation here. And then they ended up buying the other parcel on the other side of the vacant, these are vacant sites, and we designed these large units for Mexican families who live with grandmothers. So these are units that share a big kitchen to support, again, the kind of micro business that only the nonprofit can become partners with. And then finally, the last sliver is this series of accessory buildings. I don't know if you have them in your planning code here, but over there became an incredible hidden tool for us, that these accessory buildings can be categorized for a variety of uses, like a playroom, a studio, and so on. And so we could really enable them as very flexible spaces for extended families and so on. All I'm trying to say is that this micropolicy and microeconomy process yielded this model of a small parcel that is developed by the coexistence of different housing economies, but mediated by the nonprofit organization, which becomes the curator for the variety of programs that are injected into that project. I mean, this might be, again, naive, probably, but it's simple that right now housing everywhere has just been one type of housing. One architect, one pro forma, one style, and so on. I think the challenge of today's urban development, how do we produce more heterogeneous, let's say, composition socially and economically of housing within which the units or the units are embedded in an infrastructure of social, cultural, and economic programming that is smartly organized by local groups. This was really the message for the municipality in the way that people, spaces, and programs and resources would be organized. Let me finish then. I think I'm doing okay with time. I've been trying to rush here, but I want to finish by, obviously, the provocation that I've given myself and others. How do we scale this up? How do we scale these processes up? How do we, out of the specificity of these sites, these small neighborhoods, how do we take that specificity to reimagine the border region? All the images I showed tonight, come from these two neighborhoods. This is the border, this is the checkpoint, this is the estuary I showed you, this is the river, this is San Isidro, where I work in the last decade or more, the first immigrant neighborhood into the US. And to the south, Laureles Canyon, a slum of 85,000 people in Tijuana, the last informal settlement from Latin America, crashing literally against the border wall. So these two environments have become the laboratory for rethinking through this research many of these provocations I've been working with, arguing that out of the specificity of those issues, which would, I hope you agree, cover the spectrum of almost any imaginable register in the rethinking of the city today, from here can we reimagine the border region? And why not to say it from these two marginalized neighborhoods on both sides of the border, begin to reimagine global governance. This was a provocation as well, because I began today showing you a line, which is fundamental to my work, the 60 linear miles of local conflict. This became another line that really enabled my practice to question how the specificity of these issues resonate, obviously, in other places all over the world. And I discovered that the Tijuana-San Diego border is in the same corridor, connecting itself with at least two of the most intensive checkpoints in the world. Ceuta and Melilla, which is the main border between North Africa and Europe, the main funnel of migration from North Africa into Europe, and the Israeli-Palestinian border, which is obviously the most contested geography of conflict in the Middle East. These checkpoints are in the same parallel between 30 to 35 degrees north parallel, and I ended up calling this the political equator. I discovered later, after 9/11, that this political equator that I had noticed coincided with the reorganization of the world's cartography by the Pentagon after 9/11, through which the world is reimagined not anymore between the first and the third worlds, but between what they ended up calling the red zone, which is the non-integrating gap, which is really referring to the dysfunctional families of the global south, from which an unprecedented flow of migration seeking the strong economies of what they call the functioning core or the blue zone in one direction, while in the opposite direction, the functioning core in the last decades, facilitated through the politics of outsourcing, began to dismantle its centers of manufacturing, seeking the cheap labor markets of the non-integrating gap. So here I was surprised how the flow of people in one direction and the flow of the reorganization of goods and services out of this archipelago of sites of exception, tax havens for multinationals, began to define the terms of global institutions. And when you connect that to the climatic equator, for me, the words of Buckminster Fuller resonated once more, that no global planning can occur without first sitting down to debate the conflicts between geopolitical borders, marginalized communities, and natural resources. So I think that was the triad of that really is at stake in a lot of the discussion in terms of global governance today. So how do we reconcile the abstraction of global thinking with the specificity, the concreteness of these bottom-up practices and conditions? I think this is one project that continues to really be open-ended. And through this, I began to organize as a curator a series of meetings at the Tijuana border region called the Political Equator Meetings that enabled me to zoom back into my two neighborhoods with the two nonprofits I've been collaborating in the last years, San Isidro, Laureles Canyon, and the Tijuana River Estuary, which is in the middle of the two. So when we zoom into that point of collision, just to end the narrative with, the place where the shantytown crashes against the estuary, we begin to get back again to the specificity of a very interesting zone. The border, the shantytown of 85,000 people, and the estuary on the other side. Here, this would be the other side that I would love to take you, besides that place where the world sinks into the ocean, is where this tsunami of informal urbanization, the last slum of Latin America, crashes against the US, and in the other side, the Tijuana River Estuary, which now has been completely overlaid with militarization by Homeland Security, which in fact has begun to destroy all the canyons of the binational watershed system that cross the border almost tangentially, truncating all the canyons with new infrastructure like dams of dirt or roads so that the Border Patrol agents could really move uninterrupted, and in so doing compromise the fluidity, obviously, of the water functionality of the watershed system. And a few meters from there, the shantytown of Los Laureles, and on the other side, the Tijuana River Estuary. And this collision between the informal and the environmental became the site for the political Equator 3 meetings. Because look at the trash that is coming into the estuary. After Homeland Security began to build the third wall, it began to accelerate the flow of waste from the shantytown, which is at a higher elevation from the estuary. So the trash that the slum imports from San Diego to build their own housing, now that trash is going back to San Diego. These strange loops of circulation are fundamental here. But we organize a meeting using territorial conflict as an organizing tool for a conversation. In many of these meetings, I am working on my 5th one right now, all depend on negotiating permits with Homeland Security to infiltrate ourselves into jurisdictional power, just like the teenagers did. So we requested a permit that took us a year to process, to insert a forum inside this 150 foot wide band parallel to the border, so that we can organize a conversation across politicians, community activists, artists, scholars, about the implications of the construction of the third wall on the environment, since nobody was talking about how the shantytown and the estuary needed to be understood in relationship to each other. So this is the tent where the forum took place, a few meters away from the wall, the new wall. I'm interested in producing new platforms of exchange across institutions in an agonistic way to really visualize the issues of concern, debate them, and really expose them, because the people who live there don't even know how the territory is made, and we use models to discuss the issues. How do we intervene in the debate, basically, is really part of the idea here. And finally, after getting the permit to have the tent there, we processed the most amazing permit with Homeland Security. I still remember when we were in the office of the Border Patrol Director, and we requested a permit that after the discussion in the tent, we would cross the border through the newly built drain that Homeland Security had built as part of one of those dams. And we requested to transform that drain into an official port of entry from San Diego into Tijuana, so that the whole audience could move from the estuary into the slum and visualize that site of collision. And the director, after a few meetings, it took a few meetings, finally realized that we were asking to exit the US, not to enter. So he basically gave us a permit, but he said, as long as you ask Mexican immigration in Mexico City to be waiting for you on the south end of the tunnel to stamp your passports. And so that's what we did. This is where the whole audience is beginning to move towards the wall. And this is again the new wall. It's a huge infrastructure of concrete. And we're approaching the tunnel. I'm one of the first ones to cross. It was in alphabetical order. And everybody armed with their passports crosses this most contested border. And at the south end of the tunnel, Mexican immigration is waiting for us to stamp our passports. And as the passports are stamped, people look at the sewer that is moving the pollution from the slum into the estuary. So these, again, performative acts that enable the kind of visualization experientially of these sites of conflict begin to mobilize, in fact, the two municipalities of the two cities which were part of this project. You know, I already took a long time, so I'll just finish with this image because I had a continuation of this, but I'll stop there. The point here, just to end with, in one last provocation, as artists, I've been interested in entering this agonistic space, let's say, of debate, negotiating with institutions around the issues of concern that can only be made visible by our expertise as professionals. And through that, the rethinking fundamentally of what citizenship means today in the United States. Can we rethink citizenship beyond the nation state, beyond the imposition of jurisdictional boundaries, administrative boundaries that separate the city into this kaleidoscope of fragmented parts? Can we reimagine public space as a space not of beautification only, but as a contested space where the negotiation and debate to rethink what ultimately is urgent in geographies of conflict like this one, the new strategies for coexistence and interdependence today. This is what I mean about the challenge that all of us have today in searching for a new civic imagination. Thank you so much. Thank you. I took a long time, I'm sorry, but please, a couple of questions would be great. And I'll try to answer them in short answers, because otherwise... Yes?
Teddy, muchas gracias. I have a double-sided question for you.
Yes.
Thank you very much for the work. It's very provocative, for sure. My question is, your engagement has been mostly within your practice with communities and helping them to generate processes in which inequality will be diminished in a way. My question for you, which for me is a dilemma in my own practice, I would say, in which point those processes are alleviating the responsibility of governments and corporations first. And the second one, I think, I'm sure you've been reflecting about those issues critically for a long time. The second question, which is connected to the first one, how can we speed up the process, right? I have the tendency to think this is much more of a political problem than anything else. So what do you think about the idea of penetrating as practitioners, as architects, as artists, penetrating the corporations and the governments and doing the transformation from inside out instead of working from the margins?
Yes. Fundamental question, and in fact the last two stories that I was to show touched on that issue. After all, I don't know if you remember when Ralph introduced me, he mentioned that I had been appointed by the mayor of San Diego as a special advisor on civic and public works. A story that is really crazy to share with you, but it was the first Democrat mayor in San Diego, which is ultimately a very conservative city, and he won the elections, and because of the research that I've been developing in these neighborhoods, he called me because his whole agenda was, can we shift from the wealth of downtown in many American cities that has been endorsed by tax increment development, while we have forgotten many of the communities in the edges. And so he said, I read an article that you wrote and read an article in the New York Times about the work, and would you join me in my administration? He basically, over lunch, he was offering me to become the director of public space for his cabinet. And I said, well, if you win, let's do it, you know, because it was too good to be true. But he won, and I began what we ended up calling, in fact, the incubator for civic, actually the incubator for civic imagination. Later, the mayor was forced out in a way. I mean, it was like a scandal. It's complex to tell the story, but we had 1 year to work, and we, mobilized a variety of projects. That is to say that I, in fact, different to many friends of mine, I've been lucky to develop a network of activist practices across the world, who sometimes give me shit because I really like to say that I still believe in government, and that I still believe in institutions, and that one challenge for many of us is, in fact, to incubate new institutions, not to throw the baby with the bathwater and forget that there were histories obviously in the past. That's the reason I begin with the New Deal, that we could recuperate as fragments from which then continue to the next stage. So fundamental is that question of how do we infiltrate ourselves into bureaucracies. In fact, I found out in my work, that year of work at the San Diego municipality, that one urgent site of intervention in terms of creativity, collaboration and inclusion is bureaucracy itself. So yes, that is fundamental, but in the United States, I had to begin, and I continue to stand by it, with these emergent, more small-scale interventions in alliance with these non-profit groups, because they begin to exert pressure towards the municipality, begin to really mobilize the process. But at the end of the day, and just to show you, because the question that you asked, I asked myself, and I said, while I am beginning small here, which is taking a long time, and while I begin to notice that in the United States, the extreme left and the extreme right have aligned themselves in their mistrust of government, where else can we find traces of the reemergence, what I ended up calling, of civic freedom in space? And I don't want to burden you a lot with this, but this is what I realized, that a lot of that you're talking and asking about has been happening in Latin America. In the fundamental cases of Bogotá, particularly in Medellin, we began to work with Antanas Mockus. Many of you know about Antanas Mockus, who was that legendary mayor of Bogotá, Colombia, very provocative, who sent a message out there when he was elected. He's a philosopher, by the way, turned mayor, that before transforming the city physically, you have to transform first social norms, social behavior, and cultivate a citizenship culture. His experiments with art and public space are legendary. So maybe, hopefully, many of you have really or know about this. But this was an example. This is Antanas Mockus. I was going to mention this, and I don't want to continue the lecture necessarily, but the point is that we went to provoke him and began to work with him this is my colleague, Fona Foreman, a political theorist, to ask him to come to the border with us and work on a collaborative project to ask the question about the cross-border citizen. So with that performance that we did at the border crossing the drain and the work that we had been doing with Mockus, we invited him to come to the border region, because I don't know if you remember about Mockus. After he ended his mayorship in Bogotá, he began to perform what is called a citizenship culture survey that he has performed in 50 plus cities across Latin America. It's basically a survey, beautifully crafted. It's a piece of social science that is really mobilizing actual issues on the ground. It basically measures public trust, vertical relationships between institutions and communities, and horizontal modes of coordination across civic infrastructure and social groups and so on. The point is that he had never done a survey to begin with at a border region. So we brought him, as I was working with the mayor as one of our projects, we brought him to Tijuana to produce the first binational citizenship culture survey that obviously measures the relationship somehow between these two cities, the trust, the levels of trust, and also opens the question, can a cross-border citizen be imagined whose condition of citizenship is not based on that border, but based on the shared values and the shared interests between these two cities? So we convinced the mayor of San Diego and the mayor of Tijuana to become collaborators with the former mayor of Bogotá, Antanas Mockus. And just 2 or 3 weeks ago, the survey results were made available. It's hugely provocative. It would be a whole talk just about that. But for us was the platform. Because whenever Mockus goes to cities hired by municipalities, we were the first case that we were a university to do it. The idea is that the survey results become a kind of mirror to the city, an act of self-criticality in understanding what are the weaknesses, what is the unaccountability of corporations, of civic sectors, of, etc. And those spaces of conflict or of weakness become the size of intervention for the municipalities, and the municipalities begin to reorganize their existing policies and so on. So it's about intervening into those sites. So it's a long story. What I'm trying to say is that sometimes the intervention into whether corporations, which I find it more difficult today, but into new forms of governance, might begin by our actually collaborations as architects and designers in producing new protocols, because the whole project, it's Tijuana San Diego about the cross-border cities and bringing these two municipalities to collaborate really is what mobilized the whole project. It's just one example, but I'm interested in that possibility, and in that case I've seen Latin America as a model. I will not burden you with more, but I would also invite you to look at Medellin, which is the other city that I've been engaging in my research. And I befriended the former mayor of Medellin, Sergio Fajardo, a mathematician turned mayor, who enabled the most compelling transformation of Medellin out of an amazing process of cross-sector collaboration. I call it the Medellin New Deal, in fact. So all I'm trying to say is that while we continue to debate the role of government today, and we have grown, primarily, I see it in my young students, dissatisfied with government, and sometimes they confuse to be political with to be a politician. I realize that, and while in Europe, the whole process also has been hijacked by the erosion of the welfare state today, it seems like, in my mind, and I'm not saying this just because I'm from Latin America, but it is in Latin America where we found in the last decades some of the most compelling examples of progressive government, reimagining it as a more collaborative, inclusive institution. So I would advise you to research on those two models particularly. Yes?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Teddy. You mentioned at the start that public space will not work simply by making it beautiful. But beauty has some role to play, if beauty is the right word. And certainly it has some role to play in the graphics, in your graphic presentation, making visible the issues.
Yes.
Do you want to speak about that a little bit? I'm also curious how you adjust your graphics or your rhetoric for different audiences.
Yes. No, that's a good point. I've been criticized for polarizing aesthetics from social responsibility, and I hope I don't want to be in that camp. I still believe, obviously, the power of design, of beauty, and so on, but obviously some of my statements are attempting to be more provocative. But it would be crazy to ignore the role, in fact, of us as architects in our investigation in issues of aesthetics. In fact, I many times think that the site of intervention that is urgent today is that gap between artistic experimentation and social responsibility. But let's reimagine the aesthetic. In Medellin, Colombia, which I imagine I had so much more material, I'm crazy, I didn't know how to edit, but Sergio Fajardo, the former mayor, said we're going to build beautiful buildings. I don't know if this one might be considered too beautiful, but nevertheless, they built, I don't know if you know about these stories of Medellin, but they built, as no other city in the world, some of the most compelling public spaces, library parks, as they call them, public transportation in the shanty towns of the city, as no other city in the world. Incredible investment in the most marginalized environments. But they said, we're going to commit to beauty and beautiful buildings because these environments, marginalized people, deserve that as well. But we are not going to let them be objects on their own. In fact, one of the major provocations that Sergio Fajardo projected to all of us in Latin America was that public space is a space of education. And he said it, that public space is not only a physical space that needs to be manicured, but needs to be injected with knowledge. So he conceived the library parks. So all the public spaces in these shanty towns in Medellin are places where universities plug collaborative teaching and research. They're called library parks. And they are also injected with shared management and shared governance type of structures. So the corporations, which over there are a lot more enlightened, by the way, this is another thing. The corporations of the New Deal also were equally as, maybe, I don't know how to say it, like, serving the purpose of advancing their own interests, but nevertheless, they were committed to a civic responsibility, investing in libraries, schools, and so on. It's a similar thing over there. The civic philanthropy there in Medellin came they came to contribute. So these library parks are not only beautiful spaces, but they are injected with social, economic, and cultural programming that is collaboratively designed in order to assure the sustainability of these environments. The mayor told me in conversations with him, laughing about some symphony hall in Scotland or somewhere in Europe. Beautiful building, I don't know, by one of those morphogenetic, parametric architects. Beautiful building. The day it opened, it had to close because it didn't have any more money for programming. So that's what I'm trying to say. I'm not trying to polarize aesthetics from politics or from social responsibility. It's just that we have ceased to really enable that interface between, again, the physical and the social, economic, cultural protocols that can collaborate with space. I think it's a good provocation. Sorry for the long answer. Any other question? Yes?
Another question would be, given your successes, why is it that you continue to teach and don't, launch a career in another mode? How is it that teaching actually remains essential for your practice?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm masochistic, just like all of you. I was talking again to Orly earlier today about this. It would be difficult to, this is a good question also for the students who, we all go through obviously our education, fundamental. I mean, in the United States education has been denigrated to, job generation and so on, and not about the more humanist kind of agenda. But part of the issue is that when I graduated, I was dissatisfied with my own profession. I practiced in more conventional way for a while, but what I'm trying to say is that I asked myself, what other practices, what other spaces for practicing have not yet been shaped? In other words, not expect that all the jobs that you will get are in particular established offices. That might be fine. You have to pay your loans back or whatever. I don't know here, and obviously I'm not denigrating the profession of architecture. I mean, we need more and more rigorous and creative and talented architects to be building the city out there. But some of you, like maybe myself, I wanted to really enable other spaces of practice. And there's so many spaces that still need to be shaped. So the one that I decided to enable probably, I don't know if it's to say that it was the easy route, because I'm truly a pedagogue. I mean, I really love teaching and education. And after all, a lot of these examples of Latin America are examples that really speak of a governance of knowledge, of education, of an urban pedagogy, by the way, not only universities, but the city at large. So I found refuge, obviously, in the university, but not just as a professor. I proposed to the University of California, San Diego, that I would bring my practice into the university. Maybe I'm lucky because I teach in a visual arts department. I said to my dean, there is nothing different from a painter who is doing paintings, making paintings to sell to the gallery, to sell to a client. I could also be producing buildings, public space housing, as long as that's not commercial work, but it really develops with collaborations, through collaborations with non-profits in public interest type of agendas. I could finally triangulate between practice, research, and pedagogy. So that's when I founded the Center for Urban Ecologies. So it's a kind of research arm of my practice, and we continue to develop projects inside the university and so on. But at the end of the day, I've been reflecting about this recently. What I really would like to be or to develop in the next years, not only is continuing to reimagine how to intervene into public opinion in the United States, which is really an educational project, how to become, this is what I really think my passion will hopefully take me in the next years, if I can, is to become a developer of housing in collaboration in similar ways of what I've been doing with this nonprofit. So we began to buy land. The idea again is that we need to, I mean, we survive, as you know, applying for grants, collaborating with other entities, but I think that we could potentially develop the practice so that we become a developer in collaboration with other entities to produce an economic foundation that can enable us to do more projects. Without that, we need to retake the power, basically, and not be subordinated to that. I mean, in the United States, civic responsibility has turned into a tax-exempted charity. And we cannot continue in that route. So I think that a few of us are very much interested in San Diego to do that. By the way, this is a huge topic. Your fees, I don't know in Canada how it works, but the revelation brought to me by a friend of mine in San Diego was that if 10 of us, just to give a number, come together with a little bit of our pieces of crumbs, let's say, of money, and we go to a neighborhood to collaborate like the one that I've been working in with Casa Familiar, and maybe we buy a couple of pieces of land, one parcel, let's say. The architect's fee for a project that we might do is already collateral, without investing any money. Our fees are collateral. And if maybe one of our 10 in a group is a structural engineer, that is 8% more of fees. And if we together call ourselves developers, that's another 10% of the construction costs. If we buy a piece of land in a place where nobody wants to invest, but we want to because we want to really enable the kind of more grassroots development, the price of that land plus our fees are enough collateral to qualify for a construction loan. And so, in other words, there is nothing that should prevent us from engaging the development of projects. And the next step in my case would be to do it in the informal settlements in Tijuana, where nobody is really claiming that we could experiment again on social housing, almost like in Stuttgart in the Weissenhof colony, which was more a collection of prototypes based on material systems and so on. But in this case would be to reimagine informal settlements as laboratory for housing development. So yes, getting into development and housing economy will be the next stage.
I would suggest thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.